It's my pleasure to moderate this session on cell therapy milestones in 2023. And what I wanted to do to start is really to sort of frame the discussion. Now, in my world, we've been in this space for a long, long time. And I guess I'm Melissa Carpenter, in case I didn't introduce myself. And in this space, we've been at this for decades. And I think a lot of our conversations really focus on all the challenges. This is really hard, it's really long, it's really expensive. And that's where we spend a lot of our time. But if you look back and you look forward, I think one of the things to pay attention to now, especially in the last few years, is the remarkable amount of progress that's happened in just the last few decades. And a great example of this is there's now 6 different CAR-Ts that are available to patients in both the EU and the US. And the first approval for those one of them was in 2017. And in fact, last year there were 3 more approvals, which tells me that there's an acceleration in this space. And we just heard from Tim Hunt earlier this morning that there's 18, I think it was, regulatory decisions coming in 2023. So what we see now is that there seems to be an acceleration of these approvals and the development of these therapies, which makes this a really exciting time. And so as we think forward to next year, that's what we want to talk about in this panel. So what I'd like to do is have each one of the speakers introduce themselves, and then we'll move on to the discussion. So Abby.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm Abby Jenkins. I'm the president and CEO of Gamida Cell, and I'm one of the newer members from all of the panels. I've only been with Gamida Cell since September, so I'm new to the cell therapy space. But at Gamida Cell, we are pioneers in cell therapy. We've been doing this for over 20 years. We started with some of the most challenging stem cells, and we're on the precipice of bringing our first product to market, AmiDubicel, which has a PDUFA date of May 1st. So it was one of the 5 therapies that was on the slide in the earlier session. And at Gamida Cell, we are pioneers in cell therapy. We are working to take cells and turn them into powerful therapeutics to create potentially curative therapies for people with cancer. So it's very exciting to be at this moment after 20 years of working through the challenges of the development process, as Melissa was saying, to get to this point. And beyond AmiDubicel, we have a pipeline of natural killer cell therapies, which are unique because they're intrinsic. We leverage intrinsic NK cells, and we enhance them to enable them to resist oxidative stress, to increase their cytotoxic effects, and further engineer them in order to be more precise in their tumor targeting. So we hope to build and leverage on our expertise bringing AmiDubicel to this point to be able to do the same for our natural killer platform.
Hi, I'm Rawcliffe. I'm the CEO of Adaptimmune. Adaptimmune is a fully integrated T-cell therapy company, engineered T-cells for solid tumors. We've built Adaptimmune over the last 15 years now, from the bottom up as a cell therapy company. And we did that because we believe, I suspect like most of my panelists here, in the opportunity for cell therapies, engineered T-cell therapies in our case, to be both curative and mainstream modes of therapy for solid tumors. And we are, I believe, in the lead in this space. We've just initiated our BLA for our first engineered T-cell therapy, afami-cel, for the treatment of synovial sarcoma. And behind that, our next generation program in a variety of solid tumors is showing incredibly impressive response rates in ovarian, bladder, and head and neck cancer, which we are progressing forward in development as we speak. We have a 52% response rate in very late stage patients, and we're developing that in combinations, not just in late stage patients, also moving into earlier lines of therapy, which I think will be key to delivering curative benefit from T-cell therapies. I'm going to make a statement which I'm sure will come back and bite me, but I think cell therapies, T-cell therapies, will be bigger than monoclonal antibodies in time. And I think that might not be entirely obvious now, but nor was the potential of monoclonal antibodies in the late 90s. And I think to do that, you've got to go beyond the CAR-T approach in hematological malignancies and address the vast majority of cancers and solid tumors. And that's what Adaptimmune is poised to be able to do. With, I think, critically now in 2023, we're seeing the start of that beast waking up with the CAR T sales last year of the approved CAR T products going through $3 billion. That starts to look like real money. That starts to look like a real business. And the efficacy rates in solid tumors also increasing. I think we are on the verge of a very exciting new modality for curative mainstream treatment of cancer patients.
Great. And Pascal?
Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be with you, and thanks, Arm, for inviting me to this panel. I'm the CEO of Atara Biotherapeutics. Atara is a company dedicated to unmet patient needs in cancer and autoimmune disease through allogeneic T-cell therapy. And we are one of the leading companies in that field for at least 3 good reasons. First one, we have treated more than 500 patients already with our allogeneic T-cell therapy, with encouraging efficacy and favorable safety. So that's a huge database of an experience, clinical experience, 500 patients treated already in various clinical trials. The second reason is that we're going also beyond cancer and autoimmune disease, and we have one of the first, I believe, double-blind study in cell therapy, which is a phase 2 study in progressive MS, which is going to read out in October of 2023, and could change, hopefully, if we are right, the treatment paradigm in MS. And the third, and certainly the most important recent reason, is we got the first ever approval for an allogeneic T-cell therapy in the world, with an approval in Europe in December for ElevateBio, or tabelecleucel, which is a very unique allogeneic EBV T-cell therapy that is addressing an ultra-rare cancer and very severe and serious cancer called PTLD, post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorder. That particular cancer, which is occurring, is a blood cancer occurring in patients after transplant, relatively young patients. But that's extremely serious because the current overall survival, median OS, in this patient is a few weeks to a few months. So it's very deadly cancer, and here we have a product that's just got approved, and in clinical studies have been able to show excellent level of efficacy and favorable safety. So now we're going to be able to access more patients, which is what we're here for. And having gone through this long journey of developing the product progressively till an approval, it's going to be exciting to see how many patients now can be treated in Europe while waiting for the US and other geographies with this therapy. And great to be with you today.
Thank you all. So, I mean, there's been an enormous amount of progress has just been described here with these therapeutics going all the way through approval or very close to it. But during our prep calls, we spent a lot of time talking about CMC, what are the nuts and bolts to get there? And there's a lot of decisions that get made along the way, including things like, are you going to manufacture in-house? Are you going to go to a CDMO? Are you going to start at one and go to the other? And we talked about the different strategies that each of these companies has developed and used as they've moved through their progress that they've made. So perhaps we could discuss this at this point. And maybe, Pascal, do you want to start with that?
With pleasure. So Atara went the full circle in that story. We started in cell therapy in 2015 using a CDMO to be able to make the product for the clinical trial and the pivotal trial. And then in 2018, the company invested in the buildup of its own manufacturing facility in Thousand Oaks in California. And the idea at the time was, due to various aspects from control of the process to capacity constraints, it made a lot of sense to invest into our own manufacturing facility. That manufacturing facility has been fully qualified for clinical trials and is now making a product. But at the same time, I realized now a year ago that ultimately, the more with allogeneic T-cell therapy you progress in your manufacturing efficiency, the more you can make doses per batch. And in fact, I joined back in mid-2019 the company. At the time, for the most advanced product, tab-cel, has just been approved, we're able to make about 100 doses per batch. Within 2 years, we're moving to 450 doses per batch. So that type of progress in yield, and now we are talking with our MS product about thousands of doses per batch, and up to 20,000. So in that manufacturing yield, by definition, when you are in allogeneic T-cell therapy, you don't need to have manufacturing 24/7, 365 days a year. Because what's happening is that you make inventory. Once you have your inventory, it's like a monoclonal, to come back to add points. you have your inventory. You're not going to make 10 years of inventory. So the more we progress, the less we need full-scale manufacturing on a continuous basis. And that's why we decided to sell our manufacturing unit to Fuji Diosynth, a great and high-quality CDMO, having an agreement with them, which is a 10-year partnership, strategic partnership, where we can access the manufacturing we need when we need it. But we don't have to pay for the overhead of that particular unit for the needs that is only some campaigns of manufacturing, not a need of continuous manufacturing. Of course, that's very different for autologous, but for allogeneic, that's a particular feature of the allogeneic field, where you make your inventory, you improve your manufacturing process, then you have your inventory. You don't need to make continuous manufacturing. So that's why we went full circles in Atara, but of course, it's very specific to allogeneic.
Sure. And Adrian, what was your experience at Adaptimmune?
So we do have an allogeneic platform in preclinical development, but our focus for the last decade has been autologous. And I do think, as Pascal points out, in autologous, it is slightly different. And the starting point is to understand why. So at the last panel, there was a lot of discussion about the process being the product. Generally speaking, that's true for a wide variety of different types of medicines. But the impact of the process on efficacy and safety, on the product characteristics that actually drive patient risk benefit in autologous cell therapies is completely different to monoclonal antibodies or any other type of therapy. Everybody focuses in autologous therapies on the genetic edits that get made. Yeah, so you describe your cells as CD19 CAR-T or MAGE-A4 targeting TCRs or whatever. And they might have other genetic edits as well to help them deal with the tumor microenvironment. But nobody pays any attention out there to the edits, to the changes that you make to the cell material to enable them to kill cancer that are made during manufacturing, the epigenetic modifications that get made during manufacturing. And yet, across the industry, it is rampantly obvious that those changes are at least as important as the genetic edits to an effective product. So that's why CMC is so important for autologous, because it's actually a function, it actually drives efficacy, not just because you need to be able to prove you can manufacture it reliably. So start there. So then you say, okay, well, what then do you need? What are the implications of that on a manufacturing organization? You sit as the CEO of a company, what are you looking for in your manufacturing organization? And I think there's two things that make autologous manufacturing really unique. Cell therapy manufacturing really unique. One is the relationship, because of that impact on efficacy, with the rest of the organization. So the interrelationship between the CMC organization and the translational medicine team, the process development team, the research team, the regulatory team, needs to be so much more tight and intense. And it's actually not a linear process where you hand it off to manufacturing and say, can you make me some of that? It's actually an iterative process as you go through development prior to locking down the process for ultimately pivotal trials and commercialization. So the first thing is you need that really tight synapse in between the CMC organization and the rest of the organization. And the second thing you need is the most important function of your manufacturing organization, the most important quality of your manufacturing organization is agility and flexibility, particularly as you're going through development. And that's actually quite different to other modalities of therapy. You need to be able to run multiple processes in parallel, and you need to be able to make changes to those processes quickly and effectively and in a strategic and integrated fashion with the regulatory organization and the research organization. And so, I'm going to quote my head of patient supply, chief patient supply officer, which is what we call our head of manufacturing, and he says that basically trying to manage something that is that complex as a process with that degree of sophistication in the interrelationships and that degree of agility, trying to manage that through a CDMO is like trying to play Rachmaninoff with baseball gloves on.
Okay, thanks for that. And Abby, how's your company addressed the CMC issues?
Sure. So I think much like Pascal was saying with Atara, initially Gamida cell as a small company trying to bring a first product to market, it's very natural to assume a CDMO is going to be the best route. I think for us, we intended to go down that path and conserve those resources and leverage the expertise of a third party. But after we had manufactured the supply for the phase 3, we did encounter challenges. As Ad was saying, you have to be able to adapt. You have to be able to encounter challenges and figure out solutions at a very rapid pace. And so at that point, the prior CEO, Julian Adams, made a very bold and brave decision to build manufacturing in-house, which was a significant investment, but enabled us to have control of the supply chain and control of the speed and the process by which we could overcome and adapt. And so we moved it in-house. Then we had a new challenge, which was later demonstrating analytical comparability between what was produced from the CDMO and what we were producing in-house in our facility. And luckily, we were able to adapt through those challenges and work through that process to navigate that. And then most recently, we've had to navigate our inspections. So we had inspections with the FDA and with where we produce in Israel, so with the Israeli Ministry of Health, and had to make sure that we not only had to adapt, but we had to have a really important mock audit process and really getting prepared and running through all of the risks as a company that's never manufactured a product like this before. I've worked at companies that have been manufacturing products for 20 or 40 years, commercialized products, multiple manufacturing facilities, and we had encountered numerous challenges and had encountered a number of observations after an audit that we had to remediate. And in this case, we're a company that's never done this before, and we were very fortunate to work through that risk planning, risk mitigation process and actually end up with 0 483 observations. And so this is certainly not a guarantee of a path to approval, but a de-risking event and something we're very proud of. But these are all junctures that we've had to go through in the CMC process. And even as we feel pride having gotten to that point and being on the precipice of potentially bringing Omidubicel to market for patients, our allogeneic cell therapy, advanced cell therapy, isn't like our NK therapies, which will be able to scale up and have potentially one batch meet multiple patients. It is more like an autologous therapy where it's one-to-one, where from the point at which we identify a match for a patient for stem cell transplant with Omidubicel, we hope to deliver the product within 30 days. And that's a very quick turnaround. So we know that the challenges that are behind us, we're proud of overcoming those challenges, but really when you're now going to bring a potentially curative advanced cell therapy to market, now it's what the customers need and the patients need, and making sure that that supply chain, what you were talking about with the manufacturing through to commercial delivery, we're building that US supply chain that's going to be the interface between manufacturing, production, and actual product delivery to an individual institution, and having to build capabilities that are fairly unique, maybe more common in the cell therapy space, but unique in the overall commercial market with field quality managers and other folks that need to work across functions like quality and commercial to ensure that there's quality product delivered and that the transplant center understands how to handle a unique product like this sort of cell therapy that has to be combined and administered. So I think the CMC, there are two phases of the CMC challenges, the kind of regulatory and creation and production side, and then there's the commercial delivery and supply, which are different.
And as you moved from the CDMO to in-house, how long did that transition actually take?
Pascal?
18 months.
18 months?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I think there's the portion where you're moving the manufacturing in-house, which would be a similar trajectory, but there's the ongoing, as you're bringing a product to market, there often is the continued relationship where you have to produce data or interface. So I would say
it goes on for a long time.
It goes on, yeah. It goes on.
I understand that. So to switch topics a little bit, so tied to the CMC is what your starting material is and how you view the scale up and the manufacturing. So in our calls, we talked about the differences between thinking about autologous therapies and perhaps the limitations of being able to do large scale or being able to treat thousands of patients and tens of thousands of patients. And then moving from an autologous to perhaps an allogeneic type of a therapeutic, and then an iPSC-derived sort of a therapeutic. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about those transitions and the benefits and perhaps the risks of the different sorts of philosophies. Adrian, would you like to take the first crack at that?
Thanks. Happy to. We've sort of been living this thinking between autologous and allogeneic for the last 8 years. So to be clear, we have a pipeline, clinical pipeline that is most advanced, that is autologous, but we have a very nice allogeneic platform, alpha beta T cells out of iPSC cells that is the basis of our partnerships with Genentech and with Astellas, and we are developing our own programs there. So I obviously believe in both. However, one of the big advantages of our industry is that it is always looking forward. It's always looking for, okay, what's going to come next? And I think it has the ability, therefore, to see and to finance those things that are going to come next. But it also, I think, looks at those things like an allogeneic platform, which could solve a lot of the perceived problems with the autologous platform, and is maybe a little blind as an industry to the challenges and the timescales involved of actually delivering that new modality. And at the same time, it overlooks, I think, the massive innovation that's happening within the autologous space to drive efficacy up and costs down. And so I think the challenge is going to be a lot more difficult than simply, allogeneic will come and completely replace autologous, and then what will happen is in vivo editing will come and completely replace allogeneic. I think it's a lot more complicated. My view is the next decade in solid tumor engineered cell therapies, the next decade is going to be dominated by autologous therapies. And they're already a good business. You can see it in the car space. Yeah, cars were slow to take off, but they are gathering steam, and that represents 10% of the total market for cancers. There is significant business to be made in there, and the costs per batch are coming down and will continue to come down as we get to scale. So I think the transition is going to be a lot more interesting, even before you take the account of the fact that there's no guarantee that they will be equivalent. There's actually a guarantee they won't be equivalent. They will be very different products. So a set of CD8 positive engineered alpha beta T cells targeting MAGE-A4 will not behave the same as essentially a transplant, autologous transplant, where part of that has MAGE-A4 engineered in and part of it doesn't. So I think you've got to have different products, different timescales, very different risk profiles, as you are now seeing play out. And what happens over the coming decade, I think, will be driven by the clinical data, by what benefit that you can provide to patients, and how you sequence or overtake one modality with another will be empirically driven.
Thank you. Pascal, do you have any thoughts about this?
I mean, different views, of course, on that. But not so different on some aspects. I still believe that each product is different. And therefore, at the end of the day, it's not allogeneic autologous, it's which product going to come to the market and be able to satisfy the unmet medical need and be profitable at a price that is being more and more constrained. And I think that's where autologous might have an issue on when it's addressing a particular target. When it's addressing multi-target, especially when you don't know exactly which target it is, like with TILs, that's a different situation, because you cannot do today, we'll see tomorrow, but an allogeneic CAR-T or TCR-T that has several CAR or several TCR engineered into the same cell, or a mix of different cells there. It's coming, but it's a bit far away. So right now here, the allogeneic platform are more into bringing not only a way to have a simpler, cheaper, faster way to treat patients with an allogeneic, say, CD19 CAR-T, but certainly at Atara, what we see it is we want to have a better product that delivers higher efficacy, better safety. And that's where I'm aligned with Ad on that ultimately is about what your product can bring to the patients. Now, if on top of bringing a better product, and that's what we're doing in developing an allogeneic CD19 CAR T, because some investors tell us, why do you do that? I mean, there are so many, so crowded. Say, yes, but today only a fraction of the patients that are eligible for an allogeneic CD19 CAR T, or by the way, same for BCMA, are really accessing that. And in that fraction of the patient, BCMA and MM is a different story, but certainly in DLBCL, about only 30 to 40% will have a long-term remission. That means 60% of the patients will not have a long-term remission, therefore they will relapse. So there is an unmet medical need. If you can bring a better product to that field that has higher level of efficacy, better safety than autologous CD19 CAR T, for example, which is possible, and at the same time, instead of having to spend a lot of money to make it, you can make it for a few $1,000s, which is possible. And we know that that's what we're doing at Atara now. We know that it's just a few $1,000s when you get that level of manufacturing efficiency. Then that changes completely the field in terms of the profitability. It's also important to be able to deliver very rapidly. And with Tab-cel, our first approved product under the name of ElevateBio in Europe, like with our MS product in the clinic today, we are able to deliver within 3 days from receiving the order of the request. 3 days later, the product is there at the institutions in Europe, in Australia, in Canada, in the US, and the patient can be treated. So that speed of delivery and access to patients, the ability to have very low cost of goods, and at the same time, the ability to have a better product and design a better product, to come to your point, ultimately we want better product, we want to solve unmet medical need. That will lead to allogeneic taking the leadership role in terms and main role in terms of treatment in patients in cancer and some autoimmune disease in the next 10 years when it is a single target and when the product has been developed with that type of aim, which is having ultimately a better product. So I personally don't see allogeneic just as a way to get a cheaper product to be able to treat patients. That's important by itself. I'm not saying it's not important, but I see allogeneic as a way to get better product because what we're doing is really to optimize all the characteristics of the product through the process of manufacturing, through the selection of the starting material, because we use donor-derived cells, and that allows us to have to optimize really all the characteristics of the product that will allow ultimately, we believe, the clinic will tell, to have a better product. So slightly different from that angle. I think allogeneic will take the lead at some stage in monotherapy.
I would happily have a wager with you on the 10-year dominance of allogeneic.
Let's have it. Let's have it.
You heard it here first.
There you go. So, but related to this, so we're talking about how we might broaden out and treat more patients. But we've been talking about also ways to get past and further on to things that are not just the rare diseases, but to treat more broadly, to have patient access to these kinds of therapeutics on a much broader scale. And Abby, do you have some thoughts about that?
Sure. Well, I think just on the heels of the last question, I agree that I don't think it's going to end up, allogeneic versus autologous. I think at the end of the day, it's going to have to play out to see not only which of the products work, but what their value proposition is. And something that's this complex to manufacture, AKA going to come with some level of an increased price, that's going to be a factor in terms of how the products are viewed as competitive and offering some sort of value for the cost and complexity. And even if that's at a smaller scale and a smaller price point, it's still relative to other treatment therapies, other sorts of treatments and therapies, it still may be relatively expensive. I think then that goes to broadening out to the more prevalent conditions, as I think it was described earlier. I absolutely envision a world, I came up through monoclonal antibodies and the monoclonal antibody revolution, which seemed quite expensive at the time compared to small molecule treatments. And in categories where there are no alternatives, there was an appetite. But in treatment categories where there were alternatives, which certainly cancers and immunotherapies are areas, cancer therapies and immunotherapies are categories where there are choices, I think it will end up, we'll have to look at the total value proposition, even if something can be safe and effective for a more prevalent population and have applicability, what is that tipping point where that makes sense to make it available for the more prevalent population. And that, I think, is going to unfortunately end up being an economic discussion more than an efficacy or safety discussion.
Yeah, I see Pascal nodding and smiling.
Yeah, I think just based on experience, I think that there are different aspects in that story about the type of patient population you can address. Ultimately, it's the unmet medical need that you want to address. But interestingly, at Atara, we have a product, tab-cel, has been approved for a few hundred patients. That's the size of the population in Europe. It's an ultra-rare disease. And then we are in a phase 2 on treating progressive MS, which is more than 1 million patients in the world. So we are into that type of situations about how do you get to a product, if we are right, that can treat MS, that is a cell therapy. And of course, there is a scalable aspect of manufacturing, as we discussed. We know we can make up to probably 20,000 doses per batch, which will allow us to have a low cost of goods for that product and be able to treat large population. But ultimately, it's also about simplicity and safety, because that's the possibility to address larger population. And it's already happening, by the way, in terms of autologous CAR-T, where whether it's in multiple myeloma with CMA or CD19, they're coming in earlier line of treatment because safety is improving and efficacy is there. And progressively, I believe that these autologous will displace some of the treatment. We've seen great data showing that it's better than transplant for many patients. Now, if you want to move to a disease like MS, where you have to treat hundreds of thousands of patients, possibly if we are successful, it's a different story. And what we've worked on is to make sure the product is simple enough and safe enough. So safety is still early days. We've treated about 120 patients now with a product. So far, so good, but we don't know. I mean, it's still a limited number of patients treated compared with the millions that exist in the world. But at the same time, the aim is to have a very safe product, because if you go to MS or this type of disease with a cell therapy, you need to have safety. The other aspect is simplicity. So for us, there is no pretreatment. It's just a 5 to 10 minutes IV, and it's 2 hours monitoring. So it's even simpler than some monoclonal antibody. Of course, in the back room, you still have DOR with cryopreserved cells. So you still need to organize that type of delivery. But since it's relatively easy now, I mean, there's been a lot of work for various companies in the ecosystem of cell therapy to manage how do you deliver the logistic and supply of DOR and cryopreserved cells. We've seen that, for example, ourselves in doing a study with neurologists. I mean, neurologists were not used to cell therapy, to say the least. Even some of them are not used to monoclonal, and took some time to go to monoclonal. So bringing cell therapy to neurology, outpatient clinic, not in a very complex hospital system, was a challenge at the beginning, but now they're getting used to it. So I totally believe that going into simplicity and safety, on top of course, bringing real clinical benefit to this population, is going to be the key to address this large population of disease.
Thank you. So to change subjects a little bit, we all know that the biotech market conditions are a little bit rough right now, would be the nice way to say that, I think. And if you had, you looked forward to our investors, and given the complexity of these technologies, how do you think our investors should be evaluating the technologies, and what do you expect to change over the next year? Abby, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. Well, I would say as we're on the precipice of bringing some of these therapies forward for the first time, allogeneic therapies forward for the first time in the US, I think there's been certainly an investor sentiment around early promising preclinical therapies and less of a focus on those that are pending commercialization. But and I may be a bit biased as one who's got a product pending commercialization, but I think we need continued investment in ensuring that these products come to market, just as we've had to pioneer the CMC aspects and the drug development aspects as these cell therapies at one time never existed. We are also pioneering the space where these products get used. So if we're talking about how they're going to interact in the market, how they're going to generate value, how they may have application to more prevalent conditions, we need to ensure investment in being able to bring them to market and being able to navigate that landscape. The CAR-Ts were able to pioneer the commercial and reimbursement landscape, and they faced incredible challenges that our company, our types of products have been able to learn from and leverage and navigate. And because we're following as an allogeneic therapy, we're able to leverage that. Well, there are the therapies that are behind us, right, who are going to have to leverage the allogeneic therapies that are coming to market now. But we need a continued investment in order for that to be possible. So I think, I hope that with the hopeful market recovery, there will be investment both on the early kind of speculative preclinical assets moving into new cell therapies, new cell lines, but also continued investment in products that are near market, that are pending approval, so that we can lay that landscape for the products to follow behind us.
Sure. Sure, thank you. Pascal, what are your thoughts about that? What would you tell the investors?
I think at a general level, investors want to see clinical success, regulatory success, commercial success. And all of these are coming. And I think that's probably the big difference, because 5 years ago, when the first one was launched, the first autologous CAR-T, the first cell and gene therapy, the beginning were challenging for various reasons. Now we're seeing the CD19 CAR-T really starting to pick up pace and coming into the $1 billion of sales and so on. The same is going to happen with the multiple myeloma and BCMA CAR-T. And it takes time. I mean, I remember June 17, ASCO. I was there when this unknown company called Legion Biotech was presenting the data, very complex data. Nobody would say, wow, is that true, 100% CR? How could that be possible? I mean, it cannot be possible. You know? Here we are, 5 years later, we have a product that is launched, that is having excellent level of results and efficacy. So that is going to reassure the investors that, okay, you can move from early data to clinical success, to regulatory success, to commercial success. And this product, this first product, will be $1 billion products. Behind that, we're coming with other proposal, other product, and particularly in the allogeneic field, that can improve profitability of the system and bring some additional advantages there. And again, clinical success, regulatory success, commercial success. And we're not talking about something coming in 10 years' time. We're something coming this year, next year. So that's coming, and I think the investor sentiment will change. There have been a lot of technology being developed and a lot of great people working on new technologies at early stage. And the challenge when you work on early stage is you have to convince investors that this early stage will ultimately lead to product. There have also been some companies in the field that have chosen strategies to develop a first version of the product that then was not fully optimized and get that in a clinic, and then you have a second version that might be better. This is a challenging strategy, of course, for investors, because they hope that the first product you bring to the clinic is going to present advantageous type of efficacy and favorable safety. It's something better than. And if you start to have your first clinical result and not being better than, that's challenging. So there is some corporate strategy also thinking into many of the biotech companies about how do you create that value proposal when you go first in the clinic. For example, we spend time to, in fact, to delay some IND because we wanted to optimize product in a way that could really create value from the investor's point of view. So again, clinical success, regulatory success, commercial success will change the mood, and that's coming. It's not in 10 years, in the next 1 year to 2 years.
Sure. And Adrian, do you have thoughts about the investment community?
I've spent the last 7 years not envying your position at all. And the principal reason, as Pascal alluded to, is that what we've had up to quite recently in this space is a lot of people talking about technology. You can tell the maturity of a field because fields that don't have any clinical data or commercial sales spend a lot of time talking about their technology. And most of that can be boiled down to it mostly being hand-waving. My technology is better than yours, my receptor is better than yours, my targeting moiety is better than yours, et cetera, my manufacturing is better than yours. And I don't know how you judge that, relatively speaking. But now we're in a slightly different position because we have data. We have real data, and and in CAR-T, we actually have sales. So we're starting to become a proper business. And the advantage of that is that you can base your judgments on things that look more like standard, normal pharmaceutical development. The value creation point, people talk about creating, I've created a $5 billion preclinical biotech company. No, you didn't. The value creation point is when a patient receives a drug and gets benefit. And everything else prior to that is a surrogate for the proximity and probability of that value-creating event. And I think what we now have, because we've got the full spectrum, is the ability to make more nuanced risk judgments, because there are platforms out there that have de-risked technically, and from an execution perspective, there are teams that have de-risked things. And so I think the opportunities out there are much more on a sliding scale of how much risk do you want to take, because there are now lower risk possibilities out there and companies out there. And I think as the markets come back, my hope, I'm the CEO of a biotech company, I have to be a relentless optimist, but my hope is that as the markets come back, the investor community will look at the offerings that are out there and recognize the de-risking that Abby referred to for companies that actually have products that are quite close to commercialization. and that I think the flow back will start with it started with the biotech companies that always did have revenue. They suffered less, and I think it will move back up the pipeline, and ultimately one day maybe we'll get to billion-dollar preclinical biotech companies again. I seriously hope not, because I think that's a reflection of a bubble, but I do think that there's plenty of space with validated programs and validated companies at this point.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially with all of the products moving forward in 2023. It seems like at least the technology is moving forward very, very quickly and very robustly. And so in our last few minutes, what I'd like to ask each of you is to just look forward and into the next few years. And where do you think the industry should really be focusing in order to make the biggest advances in the next few years? Abby, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Well, I think it's a very exciting time in the industry, and especially in the cell therapy space, right? There are over 100 companies that are trying to pioneer in this space, and as we see how the science progresses, it is going to be quite iterative, and I think that there will be learnings that can be applied from one company to the other, and that it won't be a choice, as it has been for the early cell therapies, where there may be only a few that really emerge as the cell therapies, but really will become more, maybe not in the next few, I think you said few years.
I said few years, yeah.
But if I look a little farther on the horizon, maybe 10 years, possibly, maybe 20 years, where cell therapies are much more commonplace, the way biologics were very foreign. They seemed so different from small molecules. They had to be injected or infused. They were complicated. There were reimbursement elements that didn't exist with retail therapies. So I think, in the future, maybe not few years, cell therapies will be the next, biologic type treatments where they will be more commonplace, they will be more acceptable, and they will be moving earlier in the treatment algorithm. And whether or not that it applies to prevalent therapies because of their cost and complexity, but definitely I think moving for cancers and other rare diseases, moving earlier in a treatment algorithm than they are today.
Thank you. And Adrian, what do you see over the next few years as the biggest advances?
So I second what Abby said about product approvals. The product approvals coming up, I think, are going to change the perception of the breadth of applicability of cell therapies. And I'm going to point to our one, obviously, in synovial sarcoma, but I'm actually going to point to Iovance's upcoming approval with TILs in melanoma. I think that melanoma is a large cancer market, and I think it'll be the first large cancer solid tumor cell therapy that's available. And there's a plethora of others that will, I think, just make people think this is not niche hematological malignancies. This is way broader than that. So that's first. The second thing I see coming is, and I've said this for a while, and I've been wrong for a while, so you can take this with a pinch of salt. I just think there's huge industry consolidation coming. I think that this cell therapy field, cell and gene therapy, will mirror biopharmaceuticals, and there will actually be independent, standalone cell therapy companies in due course, in the same way as there are independent, standalone biopharmaceutical companies. However, there won't be 100 of them. There will be a few. And the route between here and there is consolidation into pharma and across the industry over the next 5 to 10 years, in the same way as happened in the biopharmaceutical space.
Thank you. And Pascal, what do you see looking forward?
So I agree with Ad and AB. Maybe to add a few other aspects that I see evolving in the next few years. One is going to be the integration of cell therapy in some type of therapeutic strategy. So combination, sequential therapy, and so on. We'll see that more and more. It will be part of mainstay type of therapy there. The other aspect will be the regulators will get more comfortable with the variability inherent to cell therapy. It took them 10 years to get comfortable with biologics, and even some of them took longer. It's going to take some time, but it's coming. I mean, we see our experience with different type of regulatory authorities. They need to accept the idea that cell therapy is inherently variable, more variable than the biologics, more variable than a small molecule. But once you manage through your process the variability in a safe and effective range of key attributes, then that's something that is approvable. And I think they're going to get more comfortable with time on that. Then maybe the third thing is to go beyond cancer into autoimmune disease, because by definition, the same approach should work. It's about boosting the immune system, supporting the immune system, challenging the immune system, depending on the situations, with cells that you are modifying. And whether it's ex vivo or in vivo, doesn't really matter there. But it's really the approach that is now working in a number of cancers, and I fully agree with Ad. The next big thing now is solid tumor, and it's coming. Is going to go into autoimmune disease, and the ability to treat many autoimmune disease with this type of cell therapy is coming. And I think the next 5 years we'll see great clinical results coming from various companies there.
Great, thank you. So I guess I would just like to wrap up by going back to where we started, which is there's been such an enormous amount of advance in the last few years and last decades, but most particularly the last few years. And I think that the technologies being developed by Gamida and Adaptimmune and Atara are really great examples of how things have progressed and how they can be more broadly available to patients and getting through the approval process, which is they're leading the charge on this. So if you would join me in thanking the speakers for this really important session.